And thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this program. I think it's a very important part of all of the work that we do in histotechnology and immunohistochemistry and molecular. So I hope I can accomplish some of the goals today. We'll do our very best in the short time that we have. So we'll move forward. IHC molecular diagnostics using the Xpress rapid tissue processor. So let's see what we have here. So process validation, if we were to define this very briefly, the validation process will ensure that an assay or process will work as designed. You know, I'm going to state this, and I'm not being critical of histotechnology or histotechs, but you know, many of us who've come up through the histotechnology realm haven't always been very precise in some of our work. I'm not saying we as individuals haven't, but we haven't had this preciseness that we've had to deal with until we you know, have begun validation processes, whether this be for H&Es, special stains, immunohistochemistry. So it's something we're really getting used to, and for those of us that's been around a while, it's a process that we're having to really work with. In some ways, for some of us, it comes very helpful and very natural, but we're going to gain more access to being precise in our work due to the nature of what we're doing. Always validate a process or an assay before implementing. And I'm just going to use some simple examples along the way. And since we're talking about IHC, I'll do more examples with those than anything else when they're applicable. But one point I might make here is that many of us have used a tonsil for an IHC control, for CD markers, or anything that we could use that type of tissue for. But all tonsils are not created equal, so to speak. So we need to really validate a process and assay before we implement it, not just, well, I'll just use this tonsil today, it'll stain for CD3. It may not. All this needs to be tested. And so we're in the mode today of testing our materials more than we ever have been to make this preciseness happen very carefully and uniquely in our laboratories. Evaluate and continue to reevaluate the process or assay. So when you do the validation once, you may not have to do the entire process again, but it's an ongoing thing. It doesn't really stop. You do move forward with continuing to validate things as time moves on for anything that you're doing in IHC and or molecular. Then validate the process or assay in a step-by-step approach. There's no need to make this a very difficult task because it isn't. It's time-consuming, it's busy, but if we do it in a methodical manner, a step-by-step approach using procedure and protocol, we tend to find that that will help us and will work out better and give us the results that would be very nicely at the end. Begin simple and build on the process. Start out real small. There's no point to make this a very complicated or even a very large process when it doesn't have to be. Process results, they must be documented and records maintained. If you're going to validate things, and I'm just throwing this out as kind of what we may do, but if you validate, document them, document things, whether it be fixation, whether it's processing, whether it's the stain results, the dilutions, the lot numbers, the list could go on, and then maintain these records at least for 2 years unless your institution has a longer retention program. They're going to be very valuable, and come inspection time, they certainly will be asked for you to retrieve them. And then set controls in place. And we're going to talk about those. It's not really talking about the immunohistochemical control slides, but the controls we'll go over and you'll see what those are, and they really need to be put in place before you start your validation, and then of course carried on through the whole process. So the quality control must be developed and maintained throughout the validation process. As I said before, it's ongoing. I really can't say that enough. It isn't just to do this one time and then we document it and put it on the shelf. It continues. It's like continuous workflow. It's ongoing. It isn't going to end. And I think that's one thing that as histotechs that we're all becoming more familiar with, and we're becoming more indebted to having do, is this continuous workflow pattern, whether it be in the laboratory, whether it be with tissue specimens, whether it be with validation, or the list could go on. So the areas of control that I'm talking about are grossing, pre-processing, microtomy, staining, and pathologist. So let's look at the first one, which is grossing. And I put here the size of the tissue sections really does matter. And I think that's the first thing we have to look at in validating the process, because we need to have things in a consistent basis as far as the size is concerned. You see unique cutting tools here that are very nice for getting the sections to be the proper thickness. As we have all heard before, and I'm not sure who coined it, but it certainly has been used a lot in my career and others that I hear, is give tissue sections the size of a nickel. We all know what a nickel visually looks like. It's hard for us to visualize 2 by 3 by 5 millimeters, but a nickel we can certainly visualize. And then once we can standardize the size of sections, then that will be the biggest key, or should I say the largest key, in getting validation done in processing. Because this right now hinders a great deal of us, and this guesswork, when we have tools that make this precise, then we need to move forward in doing that. So size of sections really does make a difference. I have put an example here showing if you use the cutting tool, the large well certainly will give you area to work with larger pieces of tissue and very thicker ones, and there's an appropriate knife to use. You know, in doing gross, which many of us have been involved with probably from early on, we don't always, or did not always, have the right tools, and now they are there. The special knives and blades and templates that can be utilized to cut the appropriate section thickness for our work. The smaller well is also a nice part of the tool. The fork to me is one of my favorite. I just can't imagine anyone not being wanting to use that to cut a very nice thin section of a cis wall, or even from a hollow organ or something of this nature. And again, it has a very unique knife to go with it that will give you the proper section thickness and ease of cutting it. So again, if we standardize these things, that's what we lack in histotechnology in many ways, is standardization. And we really need to see if we can't focus on making things more standardized. If you take a look at this organ here, and again, this is another schematic just showing you the size of sections you can use and the templates and the unique tampers and tools to give you the size. Of 2.5 millimeters is a very good size to have sections somewhat standardized to make your work better in processing and the end results of slides very unique and well done. I would think we could include tissue processing, which we should, in our validation process, because that does make a tremendous difference in whether some of the stains work or not, or the list could go on. Then if we move to the next area, which is pre-processing, and for many of us, pre-processing is kind of a new term, a new buzzword, new technology, but in some ways it isn't. If I were to define this, I would say that pre-processing is a process to extend fixation and begin the tissue processing cycle. And you're going to hear more about that in just a moment as we talk more about some of the fixation areas. Usually, a solution that will enhance fixation. It may include one or more reagents, and which I want to talk a little bit about the reagents momentarily and give you a little bit of insight to that we really don't have anything new. We're still using some very unique reagents and have been for quite some time. Pre-processing must be timed and controlled. It's not something you're going to guess about. You definitely need to put them in pre-processing solutions, set a timer, and be astute to that timer going off and answering it, because you just need to be sure timing is a critical factor. And it's usually an offline process. It can be somewhat automated, but it mostly is offline. That means you need to be attentive to that. You don't have to stand there and watch it and move it, but you do need to be close by to make this happen when the time is appropriate. Pre-processing, again, it removes water from the tissue sections. In order to use the rapid processors of today, and this can really affect most any, but they need to have the water thoroughly removed from the tissue sections, and therefore you don't create any extra artifacts. And there are artifacts that can happen, and they happen when there's not attention to detail, and clocks are not answered, and timing is not adhered to, and things aren't taken care of, at the pre-processing level. Depending upon the type of pre-processing solution, maybe a solution that contains aldehydes will be helpful in the enhancement of some antibodies, especially if formalin is not the primary fixative. There are a couple of antibodies that I've worked with the last few months and had a little bit of experience with and questions about, that they do work. They're a little weak. They're there. But by enhancing them with a little more aldehyde fixation, it will tend to bring out the results to be a little more brighter. But they do work. There's just enough intensity is there. Then pre-processing solution, it must be removed before processing with the Xpress. You want to shake it off, and you usually will remove this fixative with molecular fixative, which is very gentle. It's a transport medium. It doesn't interfere with any of the work and can actually get rid of the water in the final stage before your process begins. So I've put these two examples here, and some of this is my terminology, and you may get a little bit of humor out of it, if you will. But when we look on the left at the VIP, that's been a workhorse and conventional processor for many, many years, it's the batch processor. You get all your tissues ready at the end of the day, you put them on, and you move forward. You can have delay cycles and so on. We won't go into all of that. But I refer to this as a fixer. And because you can put tissues on, you can delay the formalin fixation for several hours, for a few days, holiday weekends, and so forth. And then after the delay goes off, then it starts through the dehydration process, clearing, and infiltration with paraffin. It's batch. If you go to the Xpress, it's a continuous workflow processor. You can add specimens onto this literally every 15 minutes, if you like, if you're using the short cycle. It is what it says it is, a processor. It doesn't fix. It doesn't have any delays on it. It doesn't know your tissues need more fixation. It doesn't know that your tissues are fatty. It doesn't know that they're not been in fixative long enough. When you put them on, it's going to process. So the reason I bring this up is with the VIP or other conventional processors, you can delay your time. With the Xpress, it's strictly going to move on from the time you set it and move forward and do the processing. I throw this in to give you just a very brief history of reagents only for one reason, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But this is a patent schematic showing the Arendt tissue processor, very late 1800s and early 1900s up to about 1909. In those days, the fixatives and processing solutions were formaldehyde, alcohol, cedar oil, and wax. We certainly have advanced greatly forward today from having to use those reagents. Then we move to the VIP processor in about 1980 or so to present. and all the little bells and whistles we have, but we have increased to a more specific, controlled, precise reagent grade of formalin that is actually buffered. We have different fixatives such as Pinfix, which is no more than plain old alcoholic formalin, reagent alcohols that have mixtures of alcohol reagents and substances in them. Of course, xylene is a clearant, and paraffin, which also will contain lots of additives and so forth. Again, this isn't anything relatively new for all of us to have these type of reagents. And as I said, Pinfix is something that's been around for longer than just the name itself. Alcoholic formalin, which is something I've used for many, many years, is a very good substitute and can be used in between formalin and dehydration. It continues fixation and it begins dehydration. Then if we come to the Xpress, which is the continuous flow unit, uses molecular friendly reagents. And this is a term you're going to hear a lot more of, molecular and or molecular friendly, as we continue to move forward in histotechnology and the tissues being fixed and processed for these types of tests that today can't be done very well, but with different fixatives they can, and you'll see more and more requests for molecular work. So it isn't anything to be alarmed about. You don't have to be a molecular biologist to handle these things. It's a matter of just being open to making a change and learning a little bit about these things. So if we look at standard reagents that we've used for processing, they stem from acetone, isopropyl alcohol, polyethylene glycol, mineral oil, paraffin. These have been around for many, many years. Any histotechnology book that you pick up and go through the fixation and processing chapters, you're going to find some of these or all of these there. They're not new to us. But instead, if we can make one solution out of all of these that will do the very same thing that these do individually, then we can cut our time down, whether it be fixation, whether it be processing, and get the same job done. Then why not? I mean, this is exactly what's been accomplished and done and achieved with some of the molecular fixatives. We'll talk about these here momentarily. Tissue processing then, it continues the fixation process. Hopefully tissues are in fixative well enough and get well fixed before they move on to dehydration. You certainly don't want your tissues to be half and half, so to speak, and then they finish the fixation process in the alcohol, because your staining results of IHC would be very much different as opposed to having it well fixed with formalin. Gradual removal of water from tissues, that's what these reagents do, the alcohols, but even the one with components will help get rid of water. Renders tissue clear for your infiltration medium, which is paraffin, and then infiltrating the tissues with the paraffin at the proper stage. Then after they're processed, of course, we're going to embed them, but microtomy for IHC, unless anyone has difference or unless it's requested otherwise, the thickness of the sections on the slide should be about 4 microns. There are exceptions, and there are pathologists that may want them differently, but for the most part, for the surgical world, 4 microns is the standard thickness for the sections. And then follow your usual protocol for drying the slides, and we'll talk about that as well momentarily. Staining, you use the same protocols to stain IHC for both conventional tissue processing and Xpress. You should treat them the same in the validation process, which we're going to go over that momentarily, but you should treat them the same as you're doing this. So if we go through the validation process itself, you may want to use or decide on the fixative of choice. And I put in here that 10% neutral buffered formalin has usually been the fixative of choice in most cases. However, the special things like lymphomas, bone marrows, lymph nodes, in some cases prostates, whatever, have been fixed in B5, and we all know why, because of the better preservation of nuclear detail and other tissue elements. But for the most part, formalin is a universal fixative and is kind of what we use here for most everything except bone marrows. We use the B+ for that, so we don't have to fool with B5 and the mercury hazards and so forth. But the formalin, I still like that. I still think that we're used to that morphology, so why not continue to use it and just work it into the Xpress, which I'll go into momentarily as to how we do it, how you too can do it. Most antibodies are set to formalin fixation. If you look at your antibody spec sheet, and it will usually have an area, excuse me, for a fixative, it will probably more than likely say formalin. More of them do than not. Some may not include that, but for the most part, it surely is there to recommend the fixation treatment. And because of that reason, I think we probably ought to adhere to formalin as much as we can. I will tell you that the time is fast approaching that we will probably not be into that era of formalin, but we'll talk more about that when I get to the molecular stage, so you'll see what I'm referring to there. Then you would select some tissue types. It doesn't have to be yourself. You can work with pathologists or maybe a resident, whoever, but select tissues that will demonstrate antibody expression, both whether they're normal and or tumor, because you need a combination of both. Normal is always going to, usually, will always stain very nice and positive. Your tumors could stain weakly, so that's why you need to validate with a combination of both, either in the same block or separate or whatever is workable. Side-by-side comparisons should be done to achieve your proper validation. And what I mean by that is, of course, some pathologists might think that this is being a little sneaky, and it isn't. And I'm not being having difficulties with pathologists. I'm certainly one that wants to help pathologists with their work and share with them what we can do to accomplish things. But when you're doing the validation, and let's just say that you have picked a spleen, we'll use it for an example, then we'll cut the sections the appropriate thickness for both conventional processing and for the Xpress processing. We give them the same fixation time, but then we document on those blocks in some manner that is not readily available for everyone to see and have a bias. Oh, well, this was processed with the VIP or the Xpress or vice versa. You do the side-by-side blind comparisons. That's what you're wanting to do. You're wanting to give them a slide that's stained and let them pick, or anyone that you choose, the best slide that's going to give the best results. And then, as I say, identify the cassettes so that no one knows, but perhaps you and maybe one other person, maybe a PA or resident, that you can do this blindly. The size. The tissues must be cut to the appropriate size. I can't say this enough because it's important. We all know what happens when they aren't, so I won't go into that. But at least 2 millimeters in thickness would be a choice standard thickness for your sections. And TMAs, or a form of TMAs, make a great tool for validation. I know some people don't like them, and the reason some people don't, well, we're not asking you to put 100 cores in to validate, and the cores are 1.5 millimeters, but rather you can use just maybe 6 or 8 different tissues, maybe 10, but make them a little larger. Certainly 2 millimeter cores or even 3 would be an acceptable size. Or if you can make just some blocks yourself, or have a resident or PA to cut them in very nice squares and put them in a block, that could be a validation tool. Because in doing so, you can use positive and negative together. You can have maybe high expressor, low expressor, in between expressions. That will give you a nice array of validation. No pun intended there. Fixation then, tissues must be well fixed before processing. We try to adhere to those guidelines. I know that pathologists are wanting their slides out earlier, and more, we just keep pushing the time to get them on the processor. But depending on how well that specimen is fixed, it's going to give you the best results in the end. And I'd rather take a little more time up front than to have to go back and ask for more tissue or having to reprocess something because we let something fix very poorly. And I know this is still an ongoing issue in most places, and that's why guidelines have been set up, and certainly with like the CAP ASCO guidelines for breast, that they've been set up to give us some guidelines for proper fixation. There's a lot of variables there. There are a lot of standardization ideas there to get done, and it's a matter of you selecting some, working with them, learning the idiosyncrasies about them, and then putting them in place, and everybody looking at slides. It shouldn't just be pathologists. It should be pathologists and histotechs, the people doing the work, so they understand and know the pitfalls and the variables that are encountered. I say put tissue in the fixative of choice, whatever that is. 10% neutral buffered formalin certainly is one fixative of choice, and then you may use a pre-processing solution fixative. As long as you validate that and work with it, I think that you're fine. Now, in doing some of these validation studies, you may choose to do this, which I've done a few, not a whole lot, but I will, let's just take the spleen I said a while ago. We may take a piece and fix in formalin, 2 millimeters. We may take a piece and fix in pre-processing solution, pre-processing fixative, and molecular fixative. And then you can compare your results. You can do your immunos on those, all 4 of those slides, and they would be conventionally processed versus Xpress. Yes, that's a lot of blocks. You can mount these on the same slide so you could see the variability of staining there if there is, and in most cases there will be, depending on the fixative. But it gives you a nice tool to see what may be very good for that particular antibody. But again, it's going to require a lot of time and a lot of validation to do so. The reason I do try these things and like to get involved with them is because of where I think we're going with molecular studies in not too awful distant future. And I'm going to save more of that conversation for the last slide. And again, the fixation needs to be timed. There are many ways of doing this. You may set a timer. You may make cassettes that have a time on them to put them in the rack of cassettes after they're gross so that you know, well, behind this cassette that's 8 o'clock, we know we're going to give them 2 hours to fix, and then we're going to put them on the processor, and you'll put the 10 o'clock cassette maybe past that last cassette, and whoever goes to get them knows that everything between those 2 cassettes, 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock, is fixed enough to go on the Xpress and move forward like that. So you've got to be creative in finding a way to get your tissues timed for the proper amount of fixation. And then pre-processing, I can't emphasize this enough, your sections must be free of water before processing on the Xpress, or for any rapid processor for that matter. Then the time for the tissue to remain in this pre-processing solution will vary upon the size. Biopsies do not require very long. A larger tissue, such as the spleen I was talking about, will take a little longer, but not that much longer. And then, again, it is a manual process, but set a timer, go do something else, and return. It doesn't take that long to move this from one solution to the other and then to the Xpress. It's a new mindset based on our continuous flow type of work system. And then you can establish a pre-processing workstation. I would encourage that. We have workstations for everything else. You have maybe a workstation for decals where you've set that up. You have a workstation for a lot of your stains. Just set up a pre-processing workstation that's got your containers labeled, that's got your reagents there, the process, a workflow chart, or what we might call a macro map or flow chart. It's any of those can be posted there so that you're showing a person visually moving from one solution to another. we're all a visual people. We like to see things visually rather than reading about them most of the time. A picture means a lot. It isn't to be critical or demean anyone. It just gives you a nice reference at a quick glance to move from one thing to another. And again, timing is very critical in this process. In processing, you'll process the tissues on the appropriate processor, whether you're going to do conventional, VIP, or some other conventional processor in the Xpress. You'll want to document which processor that you've utilized with a worksheet or some recording sheet so you'll have it. Then the techniques, these are pretty simple. We all do them. I'm not alluding to them very much, but after processing, you embed them. You cut them at 4 microns in thickness. One tip I like to give people is that you allow the water to drain off the slide after you have picked up the section in the water bath. I like to stand the slides upright in a slide holder or a slide rack and let the water drain down and air dry before placing them in a drying oven or an automated stainer that will do your drying and retrieval process all together. Leaving water behind the section and then trying to dry them will loosen them from the slide. It will cause you artifacts as well. You're asking for more trouble, so it's better not to rush, but take some time to thoroughly get these slides dried. And then one thing that I've used to help dry them is once I put them in the slide rack after cutting is to place a little fan there for just a few minutes. You'd be surprised what 5 or 10 minutes will do to rapidly dry the water. And the tissue section should then be like white on the slide that tells you that the water has been removed and they're ready to be dried in an oven or stained. The staining process, you'll select the antibody to be stained. You follow the validation procedure for antibodies, your dilutions, your lot numbers, ever how you're going to do that. You perform the IHC with the method of IHC staining, whether it be manual or automated in your laboratory. I would envision that most people these days have automated stainers, except if you're doing some research or there's some reason that you're having to do some of your immunohistochemical procedures manually or offline. Either way, whatever method you do it, then that's how you would proceed. And then, of course, document your procedure, your results, so you have some record as to what you have done. Validation procedures, really, they reasonably confirm that a new antibody, assay, or process performs well as or equal to the existing validated assay. So if you've been processing everything on the VIP and you want to switch to the Xpress, you do the validations, and there are probably several ways of doing that, as I've just described one I'm familiar with. But you'll need to see, once you've completed, if you're getting equal to staining or better with one processor or another, then you'll know which ones to stay with. Hopefully, I think you'll see the results with rapid processing to be very, very good, comparable, and even in most cases well above the quality of what you're getting with conventional processes. We'll see why in just a moment. Antibody validation provides reasonable assurance that false positive and false negative results are minimized as much as possible. Now the results, after you've stained the slides and cover slip them, of course, labeled if that's required, reviewing the slides, both the conventional and Xpress process tissues, you'll get to see the antibody expression. Grossly, yes, you could see some results grossly, but microscopically is where you really find the uniqueness and the good quality. Review the slides with your pathologist. If you're going to sit with them, you need to know which ones were Xpress process and which ones were conventional process, but don't tell them until you're finished. I know they think that's a little sneaky, but it really isn't. It's the best way of finding out what method is going to be the best that you're going to want to utilize in your laboratory. So you'll place the what I have done is I give an H&E to them first and let them select, well, which H&E is better? Which one can you see better nuclei and nuclear preservation, or the collagen is nicely defined, or whatever the case may be. Then pick the slide that you've done the antibodies on and the IHC expression and let them see the quality. Only at the end do you give them the real clue as to which slide is which, how it was processed, and then, of course, maybe how it was stained. And then the IHC expression is usually sharper and cleaner with Xpress processed tissues. Now, why is that? Well, there are several reasons. Now, all this is dependent now, in your validation, that the section thickness has been maintained as what we tried to standardize, which is about 2 millimeters, if that's what your choice is. It doesn't use xylene, number one. Xylene is an awful reagent. It's something we've all used, we've come up with. It's a hydrocarbon. It's a petroleum derivative, and just many things about it that it's a health hazard. It's something that you have to pay to get rid of. It has many issues, and it can harden your tissues, and the list goes on. You know about xylene. But the Xpress reagents, or most of these reagents, do not use xylene as a clearant. So you're getting rid of something that's bad to begin with. And with the petroleum industry as it is, at some point it wouldn't surprise me that xylene doesn't go away. Just like a few of the other things that we'll chat about in just a moment. It's very critical now with the petroleum industries. Then let's talk a little bit about molecular. Molecular is a term and a word that many times it tends to, I think, scare a lot of people, whether you're a histotech or a resident or a researcher or whatever, because we always think molecular of DNA, RNA. We see a DNA helix. We're talking about cellular structure. It's just not something that some of us are comfortable with, but it really is a unique discipline, and one I think that we're all going to learn a whole lot more about in histology. The tissues that are recommended for future molecular studies and assays can be initially fixed in a molecular fixative, because what's going to be happening, and it's really happening now more than I think any of us imagine. When you look at all of the assays and molecular tests that are being asked for on formalin-fixed tissues, we get requests at the grossing board, and it says, well, we want this assay, we want this assay. They're all molecular. And formalin just doesn't do the job that it needs to, because of its composition, to help us preserve these entities for RNA, DNA, and other molecular work. So there are fixatives that are either being created or will be created to give us the fixation we need to preserve the nuclear components, RNA and DNA and other things. And it needs to be fairly gentle, as we may call it, molecular friendly, to do the work of these future assays. I guess I see this coming a little more because of the research that's being done, of the tests that are now being offered through some of the molecular laboratories that have been springing up across the country, and we all know they are, and they will continue to do that. They're going to want to see more and more detail than what they've been allowed to see in the past. You know, histotechnologists have really been in a molecular mode for a while, believe it or not. We used to do and were the forerunners of some molecular work because we used to do the MGP stain, methylgreen pyranine. And we would do that. We would fix the tonsil and carnoids, preserve it, and then stain it with methylgreen pyranine to see the RNA and DNA. Granted, it wasn't very minute. It wasn't perhaps at the molecular level, but it was a stain that they could use in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and some still maybe use it a little today. So we have been somewhat involved in some of the earlier molecular work. So what better people are we than to continue this in finding fixatives to utilize, validate in histology so that we can do these things like IHC, FISH, or ISH, or any of those other issues, as we may call it, situ hybridization, the list could go on. We are really the people to do that, not someone down the hall. And if we can find ways to fix tissues in these fixatives that are molecular friendly, then we're going to be the ones to be involved in this work, which I think is going to be a tremendous asset for all of us in the future. Now, I throw this last slide up here to show you that for one tissue block today, these are the things that you can get out of it. And certainly in the future, if we're able to find fixatives that we can utilize that are on molecular basis, you can see here what we do. For this one block, we can do flow cytometry. We can do the, well, first at the top, you can do IHC, ISH, and FISH. We can do that now with online retrieval, with continuous workflow, with very nice quality antibodies. Flow cytometry, we can do that. Microdissection, we can do that today to take actually small, minute cells off of slides, provided that they're not on your positive charged slides. It was really humorous one day, and I felt sorry for the researcher. He'd done all of his work, and he had the right idea. He was going to do immunohistochemistry, so he had all the dissections put on positive charged slides, which we would have done. But then he didn't tell us that he was going to do microdissection, use laser capture to remove cells, so it obviously couldn't be done, not very well, and so he had to have some of them recut. Where I told him, I said, this is one instance that you really want the cells to loosen from the slide, so you can mount them on another slide for other work. But anyway, microdissection is a neat tool, more along research, but I wouldn't hesitate to say that it wouldn't sneak into the surgical field in some capacity. And then your last two, which are in effect or will be coming more in effect, are your genomics and proteomics. You'll hear more and more about that in our field and profession and the practice of medicine and pathology. So I just want to acknowledge some colleagues of mine that I do refer to occasionally, and we've done workshops together. Mr. William DeSalvo, we know him as Bill, and my colleague here, Mr. Godfrey Garcon, and he does a lot of work with the CAP and a lot of our validation procedures. And so I really appreciate being able to work with these two colleagues and others. There are many others I didn't name, but I wanted to acknowledge these. So at this time, I think I'm ready to entertain any thoughts or questions you may have. I'll do my best to answer. If I do not have the answer here, I'll politely tell you we'll find it. And I do my best to help people. If they want to write to me, my email is on the front of this, but I'll be happy to give it out now so that you'll have it. It's Marvin, M-A-R-V-I-N, .Jones at emoryhealthcare.org. Emory Healthcare is all one word. I'm happy to receive emails, and I have still a couple I need to respond to from the last seminar just a few weeks ago, but I'll do my best to get your answers. And now let's see if we can answer any questions you may have. Alicia?
Well, thank you, Lamar. That was a very nice, informative webinar, and I'm sure the audience did appreciate it. I do have a few questions, and the first question is, what about resection borders in bigger specimens like breast resections and smaller piriform cassettes?
Okay, resection borders, that was more or less the question. Well, although I have done some validation with breast on the Xpress, I certainly have not completed this because I'm we're doing some studies here. So we still leave our breast presently on the VIP. But I would think that, number one, I'd refer to CAP guidelines if they don't have any answers for that. I've written the question down, and I'm going to explore that myself. I would encourage maybe that participant, if they would also send me an email, I'll know who to respond to. On the Paraform cassettes, which we do have the automated embedder here, and we do have PAs that utilize the Paraform cassettes, and we've spent time with them, and they've done very well cutting the sections small enough and centering them correctly in the Paraform cassette so that they'll embed properly. Though we haven't done any breast on that part of it, with the immunos we have done on the Xpress process and Paraform cassette embedding have appeared to work very nicely. I'll tell you, the one thing I like about the Paraform cassettes is it's more like a framework. This isn't a criticism. It's a good method of letting the reagents flow to the tissue section more rapidly, quicker, and more thoroughly, because there isn't a cassette wall, more or less. It's very open on the top and on the bottom and allows penetration to flow very nicely. But to answer your question, I think I'm going to have to research that one a little bit. I think that if the margins that they're talking about, the resections, they'll need to be, and they probably do this, I don't know, centered in those Paraform cassettes very nicely for the fixation and processing cycle. But whoever asked the question, please email me. I'm happy to do a little more research and get you a more thoroughly technical answer.
Okay, and this is actually another Paraform question, and this is actually from Europe. In Europe, lots of laboratories do their DNA work, like FISH, ISH, and CRP, on FFPE tissues with good results. Does Paraform have any influence on these results, especially the foam inserts on the 13 by 13 cassettes?
If I were to just take a guess at this answer, I would say there isn't any issue or problem with that. I don't see any. I haven't experienced anything like that here. The cassettes, I guess, the very small ones for the biopsies, the only thing I would suggest, and I'm going back, I guess I'm kind of dating myself here, the little sponge that is there, and I think it's being worked on and improved, but I'm not for sure. But I would certainly say that that needs to be moistened with something, whether your fixative is formalin or pre-processing solution or fixative. You need that moistened before you put the biopsy on it. In the past, we had sponge artifact, and that's when we put these biopsies on sponges dry, and they produced an artifact the next morning, which was very difficult to read. But if you moisten the sponge with whatever fixative you're using and then mount the biopsies on it, then it does not produce that artifact. But I think that may be something that, for that particular Paraform cassette, Secura might be able to answer a little better than I. We are in the process of beginning to work with biopsies. We are tackling our larger specimens here first with the Paraform cassettes. We haven't really gotten to the biopsies yet, but I think there is improvement on the way for that, if I can at least say that. I'm not sure that answered their question, but as far as the Paraform, I don't see it causing any issue with any validation or immunohistochemical stains or any other molecular test for that matter.
Thank you. There's a question that's posed. Is there any comparison data for molecular-friendly fixatives versus formalin? And I can go ahead and answer that question, Lamar. And yes, Evelyn, we do have, or there are papers that were written, and I can definitely send you those after the completion of this webinar. Would you like to add anything to that, Lamar?
No, you're exactly correct. And excuse me, we've done that. And when we would validate our things, I would throw in some of the molecular fixative just to see what it would do or not do and the results. And anytime we validated our things, I always pick tissues, particularly if I was just going to research something on my own, I would pick tissues that I was going to not only do H&Es, but immunohistochemistry on, or maybe even a probe for that matter, to see the results. And it was so nice to put it under a microscope, give it to a pathologist, and they couldn't tell the difference, and or if they did, it was always better on the molecular fixed or express processed materials because of the elimination of xylene, the rapid penetration, the preserving nuclear details, things such as nuclear chromatin, RNA, and DNA. So there are studies out there, and Alicia will take care of getting you those. They're very nice, very thorough.
Thank you. If the audience has any more questions, please enter those into the question box. But at this time, I would really like to thank all of our participants who participated today and in the webinar series. This webinar is the last for the year, but we will be starting up again in January. Please look at our website in December and see what the new webinar schedule is. And I'm sure your local area Sakura manager will also be informing you of the webinar schedule for next year. Lamar, it doesn't look like there's any more questions that are coming in from the audience. So once again, thank you for filling in for this webinar on such short notice. We really appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience does as well.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Alicia, and thank you all for participating. And feel free to contact me. I'll do my best to answer your questions in the future. You've been a great audience, and just thanks again. Have a great holiday season.
You as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.